Hi, Virgo. This energy feels very interesting because something is definitely shifting behind the scenes, and honestly, I don't think you've seen the full picture yet. There is someone here who has been holding back for a long time. Not because they don't care, not because the feelings aren't real. If anything, the feelings may be stronger than they've been willing to admit. What I'm picking up on is hesitation, overthinking, watching from a distance, trying to stay logical while their heart keeps pulling them in a completely different direction. And Virgo, I have to say, this person has been paying a lot more attention than you realize. They've been observing, reflecting, going back and forth in their mind about what they should do next. Some of them have been carrying fears, old disappointments, or situations they haven't fully resolved yet. Others have simply been trying to convince themselves that they could keep these feelings under control. But something is changing, because the energy I'm seeing now doesn't feel like someone who wants to keep standing still. It feels like someone who is getting tired of hiding what they really feel. Okay, and that's why this reading feels important. Because for the first time in a long time, this person seems to be reaching a point where silence no longer feels comfortable. And once we get into the cards, you'll see exactly why.
Okay.
And that's why this reading feels important. Because for the first time in a long time, this person seems to be reaching a point where silence no longer feels comfortable. And once we get into the cards, you'll see exactly why. The first thing that catches my attention is the High Priestess. And honestly, Virgo, this card feels less like a message and more like a feeling you've been carrying for a while. You know when something feels different, but you can't explain why. Nothing obvious has happened. Nobody has said anything. Nothing in the physical world seems to have changed. And yet, something feels different. That's exactly what I'm picking up on. It's almost like your intuition has been quietly tapping you on the shoulder. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make you pause and wonder if something is happening behind the scenes. Because it is. The energy here feels incredibly quiet, very private, very hidden. And what's interesting is that I don't feel like this person has completely made their move yet. I feel like they're still in the process of gathering courage, still thinking, still watching, still trying to understand their own feelings. Because as the High Priestess sits here, there is this sense that not everything has been revealed. There are conversations that haven't happened yet, thoughts that haven't been spoken yet, decisions that are still forming. And Virgo, I have to say, this doesn't feel random. When the moon appears right beside the High Priestess, it creates an atmosphere where emotions are much deeper than they appear on the surface. This person may look calm, they may look distant, they may even appear unaffected. But underneath all of that, there is movement, a lot more movement than anyone realizes. I actually feel like they've been spending a surprising amount of time thinking about you lately. Not necessarily in an obsessive way. More like you keep appearing in moments when they aren't expecting it. A memory, a song, a conversation that reminds them of something you once said. Little things, tiny reminders that seem harmless at first, but they keep adding up, and eventually they become impossible to ignore. That's what this energy feels like. A slow build, something quietly growing stronger, something becoming harder to push away. The moon often shows me moments where people are trying to make sense of emotions they don't fully understand yet. And that's exactly what I see here. This person keeps trying to stay logical, keeps trying to explain things away, keeps trying to convince themselves they have everything under control, but their heart doesn't seem interested in following the plan anymore. Their emotions keep pulling them back toward the same place, toward the same thoughts, toward the same person towards you. And now the Page of Swords appears. Okay, this is where things become really interesting. Because suddenly I don't feel someone who is trying to ignore the situation anymore. I feel someone paying attention, someone observing, someone gathering information, someone who wants to know more. The Page of Swords feels incredibly curious. It's almost like this person wants to understand where you are emotionally before they decide what to do next. For some of you, they may be checking your social media. For others, it could simply be that they're asking mutual friends questions or paying closer attention whenever your name comes up. Either way, they're watching more than you realize. And no, I don't mean that in a creepy way. I mean it in the sense that they're trying to figure out whether the door is still open, whether they still have a place in your life, whether they still have an opportunity to move closer, because that's what keeps coming through. Movement, not action yet, not a conversation yet, but movement. The kind that starts long before anybody sees it, the kind that happens internally first. And honestly, Virgo, that's why this energy feels so different. Something has shifted, not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that feels impossible to reverse. It's almost as if a decision is slowly forming inside this person. a realization that keeps growing every single day. And as these thoughts become harder to ignore, the energy begins moving towards something much more tangible. Because what I'm seeing next suggests that this person may be reaching a point where they can no longer avoid what their heart has been trying to tell them. Because what I'm seeing next suggests that this person may be reaching a point where they can no longer avoid what their heart has been trying to tell them. And honestly, Virgo, that realization doesn't seem to have arrived gently. The first card I see here is death. And the feeling I get is that something inside this person has been falling apart for a while. Not their feelings, not this connection. I'm talking about the version of themselves that believed they could keep living the way they always have. You know, sometimes people get so comfortable carrying certain patterns that they stop questioning them. The same excuses, the same fears, the same walls, the same reasons for waiting, for avoiding, for pretending they don't care as much as they actually do. But eventually, life has a way of forcing us to look at what we've been refusing to see. And that's exactly what this feels like. I don't think this person expected things to change so much inside of them. In fact, I feel like they spent a long time trying to keep everything exactly the same, trying to stay in control, trying to convince themselves that nothing needed to change. But the energy around death tells me that life had other plans. Something happened, maybe externally, maybe internally. For some of them, it may have been a disappointment, a loss, a wake-up call, a moment where they suddenly realized they weren't as happy as they thought they were. Whatever it was, it forced them to stop running. And when they stopped running, they started hearing things they had been trying to drown out for a very long time, which brings me to judgment. Okay, this card feels powerful, not loud, not dramatic, just deeply personal. Because what I keep hearing is someone asking themselves difficult questions. Questions they avoided before. Questions that don't have easy answers. What am I doing? Why am I still holding on to old fears? Why am I pretending I don't know what I feel? Why does this connection keep coming back into my mind? And Virgo, the more they ask those questions, the harder it becomes to ignore the truth. I actually feel like this person has spent many quiet moments reflecting lately, looking back over old choices, old conversations, old decisions, not from a place of blame, more from a place of understanding, trying to figure out where they went wrong, trying to understand why certain things happened the way they did, because something about this connection has become impossible for them to categorize the way they used to. It no longer fits into the old story they've been telling themselves, and that's creating a shift, a real one. The kind that starts internally before anyone else notices it. The Nine of Swords appears here, and honestly, this person has been carrying a lot more on their shoulders than they let people see. I don't feel someone sleeping peacefully. I feel someone replaying conversations, replaying choices, thinking about what they should have said, thinking about what they should have done differently. And the interesting thing is that most people around them probably have no idea, because on the outside they may still appear composed, functional, normal. But inside, there is a lot happening, a lot of processing, a lot of reflection, a lot of confronting things they once pushed into the background. Because once awareness arrives, it becomes very difficult to go back to ignorance. And that's where the Hermit comes in. Honestly, this card feels less lonely than people think. What I see is someone stepping away from noise, stepping away from outside opinions, stepping away from distractions. Because for the first time in a long time, they need to hear themselves clearly. Not their fears, not other people's expectations, not old stories, themselves. I feel this person has been spending more time alone than usual, more time thinking, more time reflecting, more time asking questions they never had the courage to ask before. And while this process may look quiet from the outside, something important is happening beneath the surface. The old version of them is losing its grip, the version that was driven by fear, the version that always found a reason to wait, the version that kept choosing safety over honesty. And as that version slowly fades away, another version begins to emerge. A version that sees things differently. A version that may be starting to recognize just how much this connection has changed them, because the energy moving forward doesn't feel like someone who is asleep anymore. It feels like someone who is finally beginning to understand what truly matters to them. And once that understanding settles into their heart, the way they see you may become impossible to ignore. What stands out to me now is how differently this person sees you compared to how they saw you before. Not because you've changed, not because you've suddenly become someone new. It's because distance has given them a perspective they didn't have when everything was closer, louder, and easier to take for granted. The Empress appears here, and the moment I see her, I get this overwhelming sense of appreciation. Not surface-level attraction, not temporary fascination, something deeper, something that took time to recognize. because this person keeps looking back at moments they once brushed past. Small conversations, simple interactions. The way you made them feel understood without demanding explanations. The way you seemed to notice things other people missed. The comfort they felt around you without fully realizing it at the time. Honestly, Virgo, I don't think they understood the value of that when they had it. Sometimes people don't recognize what makes someone special until they experience life without it. And that's exactly what this feels like. The absence became louder than the presence ever was. The silence became more noticeable. The space became heavier. And little by little, they started realizing that what they found in you wasn't something they could easily replace. The Six of Cups carries a very tender energy here. There is nostalgia all around this card, not in a dramatic way. More like someone revisiting memories they didn't expect to revisit. Memories that suddenly feel important. It's almost as though certain moments have been replaying in their mind lately. Maybe something reminded them of you. A familiar place, a song, a phrase, a random memory appearing out of nowhere while they were trying to focus on something completely different. And instead of pushing it away, they've started sitting with it, allowing themselves to feel it, allowing themselves to ask why those memories still matter so much. Because they do. Fear more than this person has been willing to admit. You know, what keeps coming through is this feeling that Virgo brought something into their life that felt incredibly natural. There wasn't a need to perform. There wasn't a need to pretend. There wasn't a need to constantly prove anything. And now they're comparing that experience to other situations they've encountered. They're noticing the difference. They're noticing what felt genuine, and they're noticing what didn't. The Page of Cups appears, and immediately the energy softens. I feel vulnerability here, gentle vulnerability. The kind people try to hide because they're afraid of what it might reveal. This person may not be expressing everything openly yet, but emotionally, they're becoming much more honest with themselves. They're beginning to acknowledge feelings that once felt inconvenient, feelings they tried to rationalize, feelings they tried to set aside. And honestly, some of that honesty is catching them off guard. Because the more they reflect, the more they realize this connection affected them in ways they never expected. There is something almost innocent about it, like they're rediscovering an emotion they thought they had outgrown. An emotion that feels both comforting and intimidating at the same time. Because once you admit that someone matters this much, it's difficult to go back to pretending they don't. And that's where the Five of Pentacles enters the story. Okay, this card feels very personal, because underneath everything else, I sense loneliness, not necessarily physical loneliness, emotional loneliness. The kind that shows up when someone realizes a certain person brought warmth into their life. The kind that appears when they notice something is missing. I keep getting the feeling that this person has been comparing their current reality to how they felt when you were more present. And the comparison isn't helping them ignore their emotions. It's making them stronger. It's making them more obvious. They're starting to understand that your presence offered something they genuinely valued. Not because you completed them, not because you rescued them, but because you made life feel lighter, softer, more meaningful. And now they're being forced to sit with that realization. Because what once felt optional is beginning to feel important. What once felt easy to postpone is beginning to feel harder to ignore. The interesting thing is that this awareness isn't creating distance. It's creating longing. It's creating curiosity. It's creating a desire to understand where you stand and whether the connection still has room to grow. Because the emotional walls that seemed so solid before are starting to look far less convincing. And the feelings waiting behind those walls appear to have a lot more to say than either of you may have realized. Something feels different now. Not because the questions have disappeared. Not because every fear has suddenly gone away. What feels different is that this person is no longer fighting their own heart the way they used to. For a long time, I get the sense that they tried to keep everything contained, neat, logical, manageable. If they felt something, they wanted to explain it. If they missed you, they wanted a reason for it. If they thought about you, they wanted to convince themselves it meant less than it actually did. But honestly, Virgo, emotions don't always cooperate with logic, and I think this person is finally discovering that. The Two of Cups appears here, and the energy immediately becomes much more honest. Not necessarily outwardly honest yet, internally honest. The kind of honesty that happens when someone sits alone with their thoughts and realizes they can't keep telling themselves the same story anymore. Because what I'm seeing is someone who keeps arriving at the same conclusion, no matter how many different directions they try to explore. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many distractions they throw in front of themselves, they keep ending up back here. Back at the connection, back at the feelings, back at the realization that Virgo occupies a space in their heart that nobody else seems able to reach. And that realization has been growing, quietly, steadily, almost every day. The Ace of Cups arrives, and there is something incredibly vulnerable about it. This card doesn't feel loud to me. It feels like a moment of surrender, a moment where someone finally stops arguing with what they feel. You know, sometimes acceptance doesn't happen because everything becomes clear. Sometimes acceptance happens because denying the truth becomes exhausting. And that's the energy I keep getting. This person is tired of overthinking, tired of trying to suppress emotions, tired of pretending that what they feel isn't affecting them, because it is. More than they wanted it to, more than they expected it to. I keep hearing the phrase, I can't keep lying to myself anymore. Not necessarily about you, about themselves, about what they truly want, about what genuinely matters. And the interesting thing is that this realization isn't creating panic, it's creating relief. There is relief in finally acknowledging something you've been carrying for a long time, even when it feels scary, even when it changes everything. And that's exactly what this feels like. The emotional resistance is starting to crack. The walls are becoming harder to maintain. And what exists underneath those walls is surprisingly simple. They care, deeply, far more deeply than they originally intended to. The Nine of Cups appears, and what strikes me here is how much this person has been evaluating their own happiness. Not society's definition of happiness, not what other people expect from them. Their happiness, their truth, their life. Because I think they've spent a lot of time trying to fit themselves into situations that made sense on paper. Situations that looked right, felt safe, felt practical. But something about this connection keeps reminding them that fulfillment and comfort aren't always the same thing. And lately they've been asking themselves some difficult questions. Questions about what they actually want moving forward. Questions about what makes them feel alive. Questions about what they've been settling for. And somehow, Virgo keeps appearing in those reflections. Not because they're forcing it. Not because they're obsessing. But because your energy naturally shows up when they imagine a life that feels emotionally authentic. A life that feels meaningful. A life that feels real. The Lovers appears, and honestly, this card feels less like romance and more like truth. Because what I see here is someone standing at a crossroads within themselves. Not choosing between two people. Not choosing between two paths. Choosing between fear and honesty. Choosing between staying where they've always been and admitting what they've actually learned through all of this. Because there comes a point where a person can no longer pretend that certain feelings don't exist. There comes a point where awareness changes everything. And I think this person is arriving at that point now. The emotional fog that once surrounded this situation seems to be clearing. Not completely, but enough. Enough for them to see that this connection has become far more important than they initially believed. Enough for them to recognize that what they feel isn't temporary. Enough for them to stop reducing it to something smaller than it really is. Because once the heart starts speaking this clearly, ignoring it becomes far more difficult than listening. And what I'm seeing ahead suggests that these realizations aren't meant to stay trapped inside forever. They're slowly becoming the foundation for something much more tangible. Something that may eventually require more than just reflection and understanding. What catches my attention here is that the energy starts becoming much more grounded, less emotional chaos, less confusion, less wondering. Because once someone finally accepts what they feel, the next question naturally becomes, what am I going to do about it? And honestly, Virgo, that's exactly where this person seems to be now. The King of Pentacles steps forward, and the first thing I notice is that this doesn't feel like someone chasing a temporary feeling. This doesn't feel impulsive. It doesn't feel reckless. If anything, it feels like someone becoming very serious about the future, very serious about consequences, very serious about making sure that whatever happens next is built on something solid. Because I think this person has learned something important over the past several months, maybe even years. Feelings alone aren't enough. Desire alone isn't enough. Good intentions alone aren't enough. And that's why they're approaching this differently than they would have before. They're no longer asking themselves whether they care. That question has already been answered. What they're asking now is whether they can show up in a way that actually matches what they feel. Can they be reliable? Can they be consistent? Can they create something that lasts instead of something that fades? Those questions seem to matter a lot to them lately. The King of Pentacles feels like someone who wants to be respected, someone who wants their actions to carry weight. And I keep getting this feeling that they don't want to make promises they can't keep. They don't want to rush in emotionally, only to create more confusion later. They want to know that when they move, they mean it. And that changes everything. The Knight of Pentacles appears right beside him, and honestly, this card makes me smile. Because the pace here may not be dramatic, but it feels genuine. I don't see somebody trying to impress you. I don't see somebody trying to create a grand performance. I see somebody carefully putting pieces into place. One step at a time. One decision at a time. One realization at a time. You know, sometimes people mistake slow movement for a lack of interest. But that's not what this feels like at all. This feels like preparation. This feels like someone making sure they're ready before they step forward. Because I think this person understands that words are easy. Words can be spoken in a moment. Words can disappear just as quickly. Actions are different. Actions require commitment. And this person seems increasingly focused on action, not fantasy, not possibility, reality. Okay. And that brings us to justice. This card immediately makes me feel like someone has been reflecting on what is fair, what is right, what should have happened, what they wish they had handled differently. Because I do think there are moments from the past that still sit heavily in their heart, not because they're trapped there, but because they've learned from them. I keep feeling this desire to correct something, not necessarily through apologies alone, through behavior, through choices, through showing that they've grown beyond the version of themselves that made certain mistakes. And honestly, that's a very different energy than someone simply wanting another chance. This feels more like someone wanting to earn trust, wanting their actions to match their intentions, wanting the connection to feel balanced rather than uncertain. Because deep down, they know that meaningful connections require more than feelings. They require accountability. And I think they're beginning to understand that in a much deeper way now. The Six of Pentacles appears, and immediately I see someone thinking about reciprocity, about mutual effort, about giving and receiving. Because one thing this person seems to recognize now is that relationships cannot survive on one person carrying everything. There has to be exchange. There has to be participation. There has to be consistency. And what fascinates me is that they don't seem focused on what they can get anymore. They're focused on what they can contribute, what they can offer, what they can bring into your life. That shift feels significant because it's coming from maturity rather than desire alone. It's coming from somebody who is starting to think beyond the excitement of a connection and into the reality of building one. And Virgo, I have to say, this energy feels remarkably different from where they started. Not because they've become perfect, not because every obstacle has disappeared, but because they're beginning to act from a place of intention instead of reaction. The planning phase is quietly taking shape. The pieces are slowly moving into position, and as those pieces continue coming together, I can't help but notice that the energy ahead feels much less focused on preparation and much more focused on expression. Because eventually there comes a moment when all of this reflection, planning, and careful consideration starts looking for a way to be seen. Because eventually there comes a moment when all of this reflection, planning, and careful consideration starts looking for a way to be seen. And honestly, Virgo, that is exactly where the energy seems to be moving now. Not toward more silence, not toward more distance, toward expression, toward communication, toward something that can no longer remain hidden quite as comfortably as before. The Page of Cups appears first, and the atmosphere changes immediately. Everything feels softer, more vulnerable, more sincere. It's almost like this person has spent so much time analyzing their feelings that they're finally arriving at a place where they simply want to share them, not perfectly, not with a rehearsed speech, not with every answer already figured out, just honestly, because I keep sensing someone who is growing tired of carrying certain emotions alone. Someone who keeps imagining conversations they haven't had yet. Someone who keeps wondering what would happen if they finally spoke from the heart instead of from fear. And you know what feels interesting? I don't think they're imagining dramatic declarations. I think they're imagining simple moments, simple truths, simple honesty. The kind of honesty that can change everything because it's real. The kind that sounds like, I've been thinking about you, or there's something I need to tell you, or even, I don't think I've been completely honest with myself about how much you matter. There is something very human about this energy, very genuine, very unguarded, and that's what makes it powerful. The Eight of Wands arrives, and suddenly I can feel momentum building, not chaotic momentum, not rushed momentum, movement, the kind that happens after a long period of waiting, because there is only so much preparation a person can do before they eventually have to act. Only so much thinking, only so much planning, only so much imagining. At some point, life asks for participation, and I feel like this person is becoming increasingly aware of that. They know that understanding their feelings isn't enough anymore. Knowing the truth isn't enough anymore. There comes a moment when understanding must become action. And honestly, Virgo, that's why this energy feels different from everything that came before. Before, I kept seeing reflection. Now I see intention. Before, I kept seeing awareness. Now I see movement. And while I don't feel someone throwing caution to the wind, I do feel someone becoming much more willing to take emotional risks than they were before. The Two of Cups appears again, and this card feels incredibly important here because it isn't showing me fantasy. It isn't showing me projection. It's showing me recognition. Recognition of what this connection has become. Recognition of what it means. Recognition of how deeply it has affected both people involved. I keep hearing the phrase, "this matters." Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because it's meaningful. And there is a difference. This person seems to be understanding that now. They're beginning to see that some connections leave an imprint. Some people become part of your story in ways you never expected. And trying to ignore that doesn't erase it. It simply delays the moment when you finally acknowledge it. The emotional honesty here feels stronger than ever. Less fear, less resistance, less need to pretend. And the more that happens, the more natural communication starts to feel. Not terrifying, not impossible, necessary. The Four of Wands appears, and honestly, I love the feeling that comes with it. Because after everything we've seen, this card doesn't feel like a finish line. It feels like a doorway opening towards something new, something more open, something more stable, something that allows both people to finally stop standing on opposite sides of uncertainty. I don't see perfection here. I see possibility. I see someone wanting to build rather than avoid, someone wanting to participate rather than observe, someone wanting to create new memories instead of only revisiting old ones. And that shift feels incredibly important. Because growth isn't only about realizing what matters. It's about deciding what you're willing to do with that realization. And this person appears to be arriving at that decision now. The surprise I kept sensing from the very beginning doesn't feel random anymore. It feels connected to everything that has happened beneath the surface. Every reflection, every realization, every difficult lesson, every emotion they could no longer ignore. All of it has quietly been leading toward a moment where staying silent becomes harder than speaking. And as that moment draws closer, the energy feels less focused on what was left unfinished and more focused on what might finally be ready to begin. And Virgo, if there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's that not everything meaningful happens out in the open. Sometimes the biggest shifts happen quietly. Sometimes a person changes long before anyone else can see it. And sometimes what feels like silence is actually a season of growth happening behind the scenes. So for now, trust what feels true to you. Stay present in your own life. Keep choosing yourself, your peace, and the things that genuinely make you happy. Whatever is unfolding here, it seems to be asking both people to move forward with a little more honesty, a little more courage, and a little more trust in what their heart already knows. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I truly appreciate every single one of you. Take good care of yourselves, Virgo. And until next time, keep listening to your intuition and keep shining your beautiful light. I'll see you in the next reading. Bye for now.